Thank you. Simon Fell.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to follow up on some of Adam Holloway's points, if that's okay. Since the pandemic started, we've seen considerable amounts of new legislation underpinning lockdown restrictions, but also we've seen a growth in the number of exceptions to the rules to accommodate people. I'm interested in your views as to how you balance those two often conflicting areas. Is this making your role harder? And how are you ensuring that your officers are confident in policing the law given those tensions? Mr. Fawkes, if we go to you perhaps first.
Thank you. And obviously I'll be talking from a very Welsh legislation and Welsh regulations, which are even now slightly different to what Johnny's policing is in Thames Valley. So the fundamentals around in Wales is that you should only leave home for work, or you should only leave home from exercise, and you should exercise from home. And you shouldn't be meeting up with anybody else when you're out and about, except for specific areas for protection, etc., etc. So I think in some ways my officers have a relatively simple task in that, why is somebody out? Do they fit one of the criteria? And if they don't, and we have focused on those areas where it has been the most egregious breaches or it's blatant breaches of the regulations. So, for example, at the weekend, we saw a significant amount of people in our national parks. We saw a significant amount of people sledging, all of which were clear breaches of what Welsh Government were trying to achieve through the regulations that have been put in place in Wales. So what we've tried to ensure we do, and it goes back to the briefing comment, is making sure that our officers are aware of what the current legislation is, supported by the College of Policing guidance coming through, and making sure we reiterate that on a regular basis. And then the tone and style we set is where we kind of alter our approach, depending on the level and tier at that moment in time and level of issues that we're actually seeing.
Okay. Thank you. And John Campbell, if I come over to you.
Yeah, in terms of, I mean, there are some variations in terms of the regulations and law between England and Wales, but in essence a similar approach really. We work hard to make sure our staff understand, and then we set the kind of like the tone depending on prevailing circumstances in terms of our assessment of the degree of level of breaches or otherwise. And we've debated that. There's been plenty of debate over that in the last in the last few days or so as we've moved into this particular lockdown. So not dissimilar to Carl in North Wales.
Thanks. I suspect you have a slightly more challenging environment to work in, because you'll be not just rubbing against the tension between the legislation putting restrictions in and sort of the easements for people with certain conditions and rules around there, but you'll also have different tiers as well. I'm interested in how you balance that conflict, where you may have an almost artificial border where the rules are very different in one place to the next, even though there's perhaps only a street between the two.
Sure. Well, we did have that in the Thames Valley. So at one stage, I was
directing at you.
Yeah, forgive me. Yeah, so we did have that in the Thames Valley, very particularly in the tiering system. So we had Slough that moved early into Tier 4, followed by a couple of 2 or 3 weeks later moving into for the rest of the 3 counties that I police, which is Berkshire, Buckinghamshire, and Oxfordshire. Well, it was really bespoke briefings to those individual officers. So for most of policing, we have geographical officers that are geographically located, who work a particular geographical area, and Slough would have its own boundaries for policing. So in that regard, it doesn't create us too much of an issue for that bespoke advice and guidance. Now, of course, for consistency purposes, it would be great if it would be across the whole of the Thames Valley, because that reduces, is more efficient, training, etc., etc. But the real impact, I think, is on people moving potentially between tiers, not understanding what might be their relevant tiering regulations if they're in a Tier 4 or a Tier 3 or a Tier 2. Our interpretation obviously takes into account some of the difficulties that presents for people, and that's where we move into that assessment where you might be more encouraging and explaining rather than enforcing. And it's that degree of discretion that we would ask, and we have asked, and I have seen our officers using in respect of that change in tiering and that, I guess, inconsistency for some very good reasons because of COVID rates across the areas that I police.
Okay. Thank you. I'm interested in knowing whether you think there's something more which could be done centrally in order to help individual forces and officers apply the law consistently. Perhaps, Mr. Wetherill, if I come to you on this one.
Thank you. So, I mean, to be fair, we are engaged at a fairly early stage when there are changes afoot. We do get an input. That doesn't mean that we're always able to advance some of the arguments we might want to, but we're certainly engaged with that, and we do have an ability to influence the shape of some of the regulations and some of the actual guidance. That doesn't mean that it's always as we would wish it to be. So we've touched to some extent on some of the travel restrictions. That is a real challenge when it comes to exercise, and we've talked about that to some extent already. That challenges some forces more than others. If you happen to operate in an area which has got natural beauty spots, that will attract people in. But the regulations are constructed in such a way as to not be constrictive on the type of exercise an individual might want to take. So there's a balance here between trying to allow people to exercise some free will in the type of exercise they do, which is why there is no physical restriction on how far you can travel to do it. Travel itself is not outlawed or not illegal. It is the activity itself and the circumstances of it, and that's where it gets into that realm of subjectivity. That is the bit that challenges officers across the country, and that presents differently in different areas of the country. So I think what might be a problem in one area is not in another, and that's where the challenge is for us at the moment, and that's something we're actively engaged in a conversation with at the moment as to how we can develop that further. And there is an active conversation at the moment with the Home Office and Department for Health as to how we might be able to improve that to give greater clarity to the public and also to our officers.
So would you be looking for greater prescription from government in that area then?
I think it's one of those areas where it's really difficult to get the right balance. I don't think there's a perfect answer for anybody because whichever way you frame it, somebody will be disadvantaged. And that's the reality of what we're dealing with here. None of us would choose to be in the environment we're in, but we have to prescribe it in some shape or form. There was a deliberate effort to try and make it flexible initially, so that there was a degree of freedom of choice for people and that you could exercise some of the decisions you wanted to within certain ranges, but that clearly is presenting other problems. We now need to think about, is there a better way of doing that? Would we like better prescription? I think it would be helpful if we could be a little bit more prescriptive in some respects. So it may be that we need to add some extra definition to it, which would help people understand it. But this is one of those things you benefit from the experience of the lived experience. And I think what I am seeing, which is a good thing, is there is a will to go back and look at what could we do differently? How could we tweak, amend and adjust things to make it clearer for people to work with? And that's a positive in my view.
Okay, thank you. And last question for me. We've touched on travel as an area where that's causing some conflict at the moment. I'm wondering if there's any other areas of difference between guidance and the law, which are particularly causing you issues at the moment. Mr. Fox, if I come to you first.
Off the top of my head, no, nothing that I can think of. No.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Campbell?
Thanks. No, I would agree. I think it's the one in relation to consistently over the lockdown periods, 1, 2 and 3. It's the reason for being outside that's been the greatest challenge around that, the exemptions and as Owen said, you know, some of the things, particularly around exercising, how far you go. I mean, around the gatherings, it's pretty clear, face coverings, businesses remaining open, transport hubs, you know, shops, etc. Failing to self-isolate and the quarantine stuff is consistent and fairly well understood. So I don't see any other issues particularly that we're presented with at the moment.
Thank you.